previous entries to this series looking at the DC Icons line, I've mentioned that one of the contributing factors to the very short-lived nature of the line is due, in my opinion, in some small part to the fact that they would pick slightly obscure or less famous or less recognisable characters to proliferate the line. And I think a really good example of that is in the initial 4-figure lineup for the first wave. We have Batman, we have Green Arrow, both very recognisable and both very popular. But the inclusion of Deadman and Mr. Miracle seems like a misstep to introduce so early on into this lineup. Absolutely, it's great to have more obscure characters populate a line later on, but initially I think you need to launch with your heavy hitters to have that wide mass appeal. In my opinion, I think they would have been better off having a Wonder Woman and a Superman in this initial wave. But with that being said, I did think it would be fun to take a look at both Deadman and Mr. Miracle today. So starting off with Deadman, he does of course come in that standard packaging as we've seen in the other videos in this series. Whilst the presentation is very simple, the design is very clean, and the box is quite short and chunky, which is nice, definitely feels presentable. There's something a little bit bland and a little bit underwhelming about this packaging. Out of the packaging, the Deadman figure is very presentable. They've recycled most of the body parts that we'll see in this line, so it's really only the head and of course the chest piece that is new. In terms of the sculpt, this is meant to be Deadman specifically from Brightest Day. However, I think that this is pretty much generic enough that he could be any Deadman from any era of the character. I have to say, I think they have surpassed themselves when it comes to this sculpt. They've done an absolutely brilliant job of capturing all that detail there. It looks absolutely fantastic. Obviously, this is supported by a wonderful paint scheme, which has really highlighted the sculpt and really made the most of it. So it just really resonates. It looks fantastic. There's also a subtle paint wash running through the rest of the figure as well in key places to highlight some of the muscle groups, for example. I'm also glad that we have a different tone of red for the gloves and on the boots, but sadly they have opted to just paint it around rather than giving it a bit more texture, a bit of a rim in the plastic. It's just been painted on, so it doesn't look quite as effective as it could do. I'm also not a huge fan of the letter D that's been painted onto his torso there. It's a little bit too thin, it's a little bit too tall, it doesn't look quite right to me personally, and I think it should have just been a little bit shorter and a little bit chunkier. In terms of articulation, he does of course have the same scheme that we've seen on all the other figures in this line. He has a ball joint in the head, so he can spin his head from side to side, and there's a little bit of give when it comes to looking up and down, but not a huge amount. Although pleasingly, his high collar there is actually a fairly malleable plastic, so there's no hindrance there to being able to turn the head, which is a relief. He does have the ball jointed shoulders, so of course he can kick his arms up and out, which is great. It's complemented by an upper bicep swivel as well, which is brilliant. There's a double jointed elbow there. I don't know if you can always get the most out of this because of the big muscle that we see at the bicep, which is a shame. And then finally there is a pin swivel at the wrist, so of course that wrist can rotate 360 degrees and it also hinges forwards and backwards as well. Now he does have a ball joint in the chest, so he can spin his upper torso from side to side, and that's basically all you can do with it. It is quite stiff, it's not the easiest joint in the world, but you can't really move it forwards or lean it side to side. He does though have an ab crunch in the lower waist, so he can bend forwards and backwards. It's not a huge range of motion, but it is certainly enough. There's another ball joint in the hip, so the legs kick out, they kick forwards and backwards a little bit, and then there is another double joint at the knee, so the leg can kick all the way back there. And then there is an ankle pivot as well, allowing the foot to move from side to side and forwards and backwards. In terms of accessories, he doesn't really come with a lot, but that, to be fair, is pretty true to character. There's not an awful lot you could give this character. He does come with an extra pair of hands and this sort of ghostly Deadman spirit shell that can be placed on other figures. The idea, of course, is that this can indicate that character has been possessed by Deadman. It is obviously a very thin piece of rubber, and it is painted, which is quite nice, but it does look a little bit silly. I'm not entirely convinced that it works particularly well. You can place it on another figure, so here we have, obviously, Mr. Miracle possessed by Deadman. It doesn't look great, to be honest. So all in all, a fairly simple figure as part of this lineup. There's no real surprises here. There's nothing really extra special about this figure. If you have a soft spot for Deadman like myself, then I think you'll really appreciate having him in the collection. If you've never heard of the character before though, then you're probably going to pass on picking this up. Next up, we have Mr. Miracle. I've got to be honest, this is a character that I'm really not that familiar with at all, but I did really like this figure. In terms of the packaging, I really don't have anything new to say. You know my thoughts on this. I think it's a little bit too bland, a little bit too simple. It's not the most colourful or the most attractive packaging in the world. Likewise, when we look at the side panel, it just seems like a wasted opportunity to have some really interesting comic book imagery here. And then on the reverse, although the design is quite nice, like I said, it's very clean, it's just a little bit bland and, yeah, not the most exciting. But the figure itself is a completely different story, and I have to say he's probably the most colourful and most visually striking figure in this entire collection. As I said, this is a character I'm not really familiar with, and ordinarily I might have passed, but when I saw how colourful and just the fantastic paint job they've done on this figure, I knew I wanted to pick him up. Now, this is meant to be based on his appearance in Earth 2. It looks to be pretty accurate from what I can tell. The head sculpt in particular looks to be pretty much pitch perfect. And whilst they've pretty much recycled the standard body parts that we've seen on the other figures in this line, what an amazing job they've done with the paints there. They've used a metallic paint to make this really eye-catching. It catches the light something wonderful, and it just looks very, very visually striking. It's absolute joy to have on display. Even his cape has a slight metallic sheen to that rubber, which is fantastic. And what's nice, it's also shaped very differently to the other capes we've seen as this lineup. It's very different from Superman and Batman's, which was more of a straight affair. This actually has a little bit of a curve to it, which is pretty cool, makes it a bit more visually interesting. Like Deadman, his gloves and his boots are pretty much just painted on, but I think it's just so much more effective here because there's so many colours that it just kind of blends in seamlessly. I think they've done a really nice job of this. Now, in terms of accessories, he does fare a little bit better than some of the other figures in this initial lineup. He does come with an extra pair of hands. He comes with 2 yellow discs that he can stand on and move around on to simulate that air walking that he has. And then finally he comes with this small cube. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this is, apologies, but it is very nicely sculpted and well painted. I'm also delighted to be able to tell you that he holds the cube perfectly in his grip, and it is nice and solid and tight. I did have my doubts because there's no peg or anything to keep it in place, but he seems to grip it just absolutely perfectly and doesn't seem to be any danger of it falling out of his grip, which is lovely stuff. And it looks pretty impressive and to a decent scale. Meanwhile, those air walking discs do have a peg that plug into his feet nice and easily, and they have these little rollers on the bottom of them as well, which means of course that you can simulate him walking around or floating around wherever you want him. So I think these look pretty good. They're fairly functional. They're a little bit stiff, so maybe they don't roll quite as smoothly as I would like, but nevertheless I think it's a nice idea and it works pretty well in the main. All in all then, a pretty nice figure. I have to say he's one of my favourites from this entire line, which is good going considering it's a character I'm not really familiar with at all. But my love of this figure really comes down to that incredible paint job. I just think it looks absolutely fantastic. So there you have it, 2 slightly unusual characters to introduce to your first wave of this new line, but nevertheless quite successful in their own ways, and I think in particular the Mr. Miracle is out one of the standouts of this entire collection. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.